I love talking about ungrading, and so I am thrilled to be here. I'm going to talk today about making ungrading work for you and your students. As Igor said, I am a fifth-year PhD candidate here at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I researched for my dissertation the emergence of grades in the early first-year composition program and the grassroots level shift towards ungrading starting in 2020 and continuing on through 2022. I started using a hybrid version of ungrading in 2019, and then in 2020, I switched to an all ungrading version. And so I've been using it for about 3 years. And a lot of what I talk about today kind of comes out of my own experience in the classroom, my own practice in the classroom, and what I have found works and doesn't work. So to kind of give you a sense of where we're going, I'm going to start a little bit with some get to know you type questions, get a sense of what your goals are for the session, where people are coming from. And then we'll turn to talking a little bit about where grades come from, what we know about grades and their impact on learning. And then I'll shift towards talking about the philosophy of ungrading, some of the things that we might see with ungrading. And I am going to leave time I want to make sure to leave time for two things, for a breakout session and for some Q&A. Because one of the things that I find really helpful is people getting a chance to talk with other educators about, okay, this seems interesting and workable, here's how I want to apply it. This seems less interesting, this seems less workable, I have a question about it, let's think through it live. So I have some embedded polls here. And this, whoa, yes, excellent, there it is. All right, so you should be able to visit the pollev.com website listed, or to text Megan von Berg 501 to 37607, and then respond with A, B, C, or D. And this is just a chance to tell me a little bit about where you are coming from with ungrading. So I will chill here. All right. That's fun. Part of the reason I ask is that, as Igor mentioned, I came and I talked about this in 2020. And so one of the things I want to check is kind of where people are and make sure that I'm targeting correctly. All right. Thank you so much for putting the link in the chat, Jason. All right, I'm seeing a pretty widespread group here. That's kind of fun. I'm also seeing people who have tried some things out. I would love at some point to hear what that looked like for you. So I'm going to go ahead now and move on to the next question. Hopefully. Come on. There it goes. No, wait. All right, there we go. So this is a more open-ended question. One of the things, and I'll talk about this as the talk goes on, but one of the things that I find is that the outcomes that we see with ungrading, our experience with ungrading, is really deeply rooted in our goals as an educator. And so I want to take a moment here to kind of frame our conversation and think about, when you step into the classroom, what do you want your students to get out of it? What kind of experience do you want your students to have? What kind of environment do you want to cultivate for your students? All right, so creativity, critical thinking, student empowerment. I'm seeing transfer, helping students move their knowledge out of the classroom into other contexts, inspiring students. So there's a really affective component here. More on critical thinking, learn new ways of thinking. There's a lot of creativity and risk taking here. We want students to feel free to kind of try out new things. We want them to feel free to experiment. We want them to have fun. Excellent. I'm with you on that. Fostering learning rather than grade obsession. Ongoing learning, so something that's continuous. I absolutely agree. Not memorizing information. All right, so we're going to set this question against this one. So I want you to finish the sentence. Grades are what? Okay. Required, right? Reflective. Efficient. A motivator. Oh, I'm seeing anxiety in there. Evil. I'm seeing a lot of people put evil. Unnecessary evil, I think, is probably the word. They're overly emphasized. I'm not sure I should have done this as a word cloud. Here's my takeaway, even though I feel like word cloud was probably the wrong format for this, which is that my sense is that I'm seeing a contrast between how we perceive grades and the things that we want our students to get out of our classes. We want our students to be creative, critical thinkers who can take risks, who can try new things, who can build up knowledge that they can move out into other contexts. We want them to have fun. And we perceive grades as boring, as a necessary evil, as causing students some anxiety, as having less use value or less importance. I see uncritical there. We don't, they kind of flatten our ability for thinking. And so this is where I want to start, with this conflict between what grades do and what we want what experience we want our students to have in our class. So I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about the history of grades now. I find this to be really helpful in terms of thinking about, all right, here's the background. Why are we interested in ungrading? Why are we interested in changing our assessment practices? Because knowing the why can kind of give us direction and help us make decisions. So we know three things about grades and grading from the research. The first thing we know is that grades interfere with learning. We know that students tend to value grades over learning the material. And a lot of this is simply rooted in what happens when we assign quantitative measurements to things, whether that's an A or whether that's a 95% or 100%, and especially when those quantitative measurements are really important in students' future, that they can leverage them into concrete outcomes, such as getting a scholarship or getting into a degree program they want, getting into graduate school, getting a certain job. So when we have that measurement and we tell students that it's worth something, students' priorities are naturally going to shift away from, all right, I want to do the thing for its own sake, to, all right, I want to chase as high a number as I possibly can. And they start trying to effectively game the system or chase that reward of a high number, which is why we get students coming up to us going, Prof B, what do I have to do to get an A in this class? That's not, students making very sensible decisions because those grades are worth something to their professional future. And when we have them in the mix as an important measurement, their values are naturally going to shift. As a side point, I'll say that this process is called value capture, and it comes out of some of the philosophical literature. I've put a link in the resources that I provided to you, and I'm indebted to a philosophy friend of mine for kind of working me through this point. The second thing that we know about grades and grading is that they primarily serve institutional needs. In fact, they kind of came into being to serve institutional needs. And this, in a way, is a really good thing about grades and grading. If you look into the history of grading, one of the things that you'll find is that they really started coming into more widespread use when education became more widespread in the United States, when more students started regularly attending school, when getting an elementary, middle school, high school education became much more common. And as enrollment went up, institutions needed a way to record students' educational experiences in a way that let them talk within the institution and across institutions about the kinds of experiences that students were having. And so this is actually a really good outcome for grade, a good purpose or a good outcome for grades. But what it does mean is that, again, grades are not for the student, they're for the institution. They're an institutional kind of record keeping. And so they're not really related to, all right, this is actually going to help our students learn. This is going to help students do well in the classes. And the same way that students can get distracted by the ideal form of grades, they want the 80, they want the A, they want the 100%. Institutions can get distracted by this too. If you go back into some of the historical records here at UT, you'll see a lot of the College of Arts and Science or the university coming to certain departments that it perceives as giving out too many A's and saying, no, you can't do that. We need your grades to fall more in a bell curve. We need you to give fewer A's. And a lot of this is kind of rooted in the perception that, the bell curve is the most objective, is a sign of objectivity. It's rooted in the institution's goals to be perceived as a really rigorous elite institution. And so grades wind up serving institutional purposes rather than our students. And then the third thing that we know about grades and grading is that they make it harder for students from certain backgrounds to enter and succeed at college. We also know from the history that grades kind of rose up in tandem with standardized testing. And standardized testing was really intentionally developed as a way to decide who got into college and who could stay in college and who did not get to stay in college. And often it was used as a way of preventing certain groups of people from accessing a college education and from succeeding in that way. And so these days we have far more students attending college. We have students from a much wider range of backgrounds attending college. And so when we're using grades and grading, we're using this tool that was linked to efforts to prevent those students from doing well in college. We're using a tool that may actually make it harder for our students to thrive and not easier. So that brings me to, what is ungrading? Ungrading is a range of practices that can be mixed and matched depending on teachers' goals, pedagogical styles, discipline, course. I really like thinking of ungrading not as one specific practice. You need to do this and this and this and this for it to count as ungrading. There's one right way to ungrade. There's a wrong. There's a right and wrong way to ungrade. Thinking about it as a range of practices or as a mindset is much more effective because it invites teachers into thinking about, what are some ways that I can try out ungrading? What are some ways that I can experiment with this? What are some ways I can improve assessment for my students without feeling compelled to, all right, I'm going to switch everything all in one semester. I myself took about 3 semesters to fully move away from a conventionally graded class to an ungraded class. I took longer than that, if you include the semesters before I learned about ungrading, where I was using more of a total point system because it was more transparent for students. So I think the mindset that unites all of these practices is that ungrading sets out to de-emphasize, at least in the calculation of students' grades, it sets out to de-emphasize measurements of how good we think students' work is. All right, I think your work is 87% good, or I think your work is worth an A- against a singular standard, and instead it aims to make the full range of grades available to all students. All students can walk into our class regardless of their background, regardless of their prior skills, and receive any of the grades possible. It puts control back in their hands, and it's a really good way of prioritizing students' existing knowledge, their agency and ability to make choices, and some of their life experiences that may affect the way that they move through the class. So by way of illustrating what I mean by thinking about the full range of grades, before I came to the University of Tennessee for my PhD, I was on faculty at a small school in Northeast Iowa. And this particular school drew students across a wide range of demographics. We would get students from high schools that had prepared them really well for college, and we would get students who had never written a paper before they rolled up into my course. And one of the things that I think teachers find when they work with really underprepared students, certainly I found this to be the case because I hadn't heard about ungrading then. I didn't know that there were alternatives, and I would find myself thinking, oh, maybe if a student is really underprepared, they can only get up to a C in my class, or they can only get up to a B in my class, and that's going to have to be good enough. And that's not a great conversation to have. That's really a way of thinking about students that is limiting, and that does not acknowledge the amount of work that they're putting in to succeed in my course. And so by shifting the grading mechanism away from, I'm going to measure how good I think your work is and attach a quantitative number to that measurement. Instead, I put it on student labor or their work for the course. I'll talk about that in a minute. But by moving into that new system, it's possible for any student to get an A in my class. It doesn't mean, by the way, that I'm not providing feedback. It doesn't mean that they're not getting information and support and coaching about how to make their work better, give tons of feedback every semester. That's just not attached to the grade anymore. I don't want to spend too long on talking about what specifically ungrading can look like, because I find that this varies so widely by discipline. But I do want to kind of give you an overview of what it looks like for me, and also some other alternatives, what it could look like in a STEM course, for instance, because I want us to have something concrete in mind to kind of visualize. All right, so like, what does it actually look like to de-emphasize these measurements? So I'm going to start from the bottom there. I use what's called labor-based grading. As I tell my students, if you do the work, you will get an A in the course. And I spell out for them what the work entails. It entails passing all of their projects, participating in all of the peer reviews, participating in the rubric generating discussions, doing a certain amount of participation work. And if they do all of those things and we track it over the course of the semester, they will get an A. Labor-based grading wouldn't work for me, though, without certain other kinds of assessments. I do a lot with self and collaborative assessments. These two items work for the same purpose, which is I'm continually asking students, okay, we've had this entire unit on how to write instructions and how to make them, user-friendly, accessible. What do you think goes into an effective set of instructions? What do you think makes an ineffective set of instructions? And then once they submit their project, I say, how did the process of pulling it together work for you? What are you really proud of here? What do you think you could do better at? And this is a way of inviting students into the process of assessing their own work, kind of strengthening their ability to self-assess, which is a skill that they're going to need in other non-writing intensive courses. It's a skill that they're going to need in graduate school or on the job. And it's a way of respecting my students' perspective of their own work so that I'm listening to them as I am assessing. I also use flexible late and attendance policies. I accept quite a bit of work for full credit up until the end of term, all major projects and homework assignments. If I don't accept it late, then I provide students multiple ways to submit it online or in person, for instance. And though I give students credit for attendance, I don't penalize them for attendance. So a student is not going to fail my course if they miss too many courses, for instance. And closely related to that is I give them a menu of options for participation. So it doesn't look like, hi, please speak up in class, but it can look like taking a project to the writing center. It can look like doing 80% of the readings. It can look like interviewing somebody in the field that they want to go into about what good writing is. And so this is a good way for me to kind of play to my students' strengths and give them options of work that they can do that fit with who they are as a person. This is what works for me in the writing courses that I teach. One of the things that I've really loved about doing ungrading research over the last few years, though, is seeing what people in other disciplines use. So colleagues who are in STEMier departments, colleagues who are in social sciences might use things like minimal grading, where maybe they keep the main projects conventionally graded, but they take some smaller assignments and they make those pass-fail. This, by the way, is what I did when I was first coming into ungrading. Is I kept the major projects graded and converted everything else to pass-fail. It was really a good way for me to experiment with this. They may make tests pass-fail up to a certain percentage. So to pass the test, you need to get at least a 70%, and that's the primary measure that we'll use, is whether you've passed this test. This can be a really good way, especially in disciplines that require students to have certain content knowledge. Can you tell me in a geology course, can you tell me what the 3 major kinds of rocks are, or for instance? Or the last one here is critique-driven assessment or specs grading, where students have to meet certain standards or perform certain activities by the end of the class. And rather than giving students a grade on their performance and then moving on, critique-driven assignments ask them to do a rough draft, gives them feedback, and asks them to redo it, and so on over the course of the semester. I think I placed, there's a possibility I missed it, but if I did, I'll check after this presentation and make sure it's in there. I've placed Susan Blum's edited collection Ungrading in the list of resources, and then I'll also make sure I've got Linda Nilsson's specs grading as a reference in there, because both of those I think are really good at describing this particular version of ungrading, and I think it can work really well for more content-focused courses. So a couple of things that I find that ungrading can do. I think that by attaching credit or attaching students' grades to things like the work that they do or to passing certain assignments, it gives students room to meet some of those goals that we were talking about earlier, to think critically, to think creatively, to have a little bit more fun with the class without worrying about, this might not get me an A, I might be jeopardizing my A or my 100%. They can take risks a little bit more. It's a good way of encouraging metacognitive thinking. This is a good way of building transfer. We know from the research that when students are thinking about, okay, what went well for me on that assignment, what didn't go so well for me on that assignment, when they're assessing themselves, what that does is it takes what they're learning from the subconscious to the conscious level, and so they can carry it forward into other classes, into other contexts. It's a really good way of giving students a say in how they are assessed. So one of the important assumptions behind ungrading is making sure that we're listening to students' account of their experiences, and we're not coming in and saying, I know you thought you did a good job on that paper, but that's actually a terrible job. And we're acknowledging where they've tried, what they've been learning, where they've grown, even if it might not be visible through a conventional lens. And then the last point here is that it's a good way to account for students' out of class experiences. So it's not really an accident that interest in ungrading has really grown since 2020. We've had a lot of chaos in the educational environment over the last couple of years, adjusting to new ways of learning, adjusting to unexpected illnesses, unexpected, requirements about where we work and where we learn, how we work and how we learn. And so building some flexibility and building multiple ways to complete the same assignment and attaching credit into things that are easier for students to work towards than simply, meet the standard that I have set and that I am going to judge you on is a really good way to accommodate students as they're navigating through some of this chaos. One thing I do want to stress is that the outcomes are really closely linked to people's goals and assumptions. And this became clear to me when I was doing became clear to me through a number of ways. But one of the things that I really want to highlight for you is this passage from Inman and Powell. And Inman and Powell are two researchers in my field in rhetoric and writing. And they conduct a study of people who are using labor-based grading. And they say, we're not sure it works that well. Like, students are really attached to their grades. They feel kind of at a loss without, like, they'd rather be told they're a C student in the class than, have the chance to get an A and just not have any grades. And this article made me uncomfortable for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that kind of stood out to me is encapsulated in this quotation that I've placed up on the screen here, which is they're talking to an instructor who actually is using ungrading. They're using a version of labor-based grading. And the instructor says, I really like being able to use grades to frighten students. The fear factor aspect of getting an F within the first month of your first semester of college. I grade really hard on the first one to let them know, like, there's something at the end there. And then the instructor comes back and says, I can't do that with ungrading, and it bugs me. And I read this and I'm just like, it kind of makes sense why you're not seeing the outcomes with ungrading, with labor-based grading, that you wanted to see. If you go into it holding on to some of these assumptions about, I've got to get students to the standard that I've set, I've got to emphasize the gap between that standard and their own current work, I've got to scare students, you might not see the best outcomes. But my belief is that if your goal is to acknowledge the assets that students bring to the class, to cultivate learning and metacognitive thinking, to put more of students' grade in their control, then you will see good outcomes, even if all that's available to you is just a little bit of ungrading, which is kind of where what I want to stress. Here, as I'm reaching the end of the part of the talk where I talk, before we move into the breakout rooms, is if you're here and you're thinking about, like, okay, I want to try ungrading. What I want to stress is that it's important to know what you want to get out of ungrading. The goals that you have with it are going to drive your decisions, which is in turn is going to drive the outcomes that you see. I also want to stress that ungrading is not one specific thing. I've talked about my practice, but my practice is not going to work for everybody across all disciplines. Choose practices that work for you and for your discipline. And closely related to that, don't feel as though ungrading is all or nothing. It's really okay to keep trying stuff out, to take baby steps, maybe to make a few things ungraded this semester, see how it goes. And then in next semester, the semester after, expand that a little bit further. And then ungrading may look different discipline to discipline, but I think it's possible in all disciplines. I don't teach STEM, and so I can't really come in here and be like, all right, here's the one right way to do ungrading in STEM, but I have tried to point you to a number of resources that would help you think through that for your own contexts. So what I want to do now is, let's see, it is 12:35, so we're doing great on time. I have a set of questions for some breakout rooms. And then I also want to make sure to leave time for Q&A. So maybe if we could do breakout rooms for about 10 minutes, and that'll leave us about another 5 to 10 minutes for a Q&A. Does that sound okay, Igor?
Yes.
Awesome. So I will go ahead and put well, no, I can't put those questions in the chat because I'm in screen share. I'll read through the questions and then we can move into the breakout rooms, and that'll give you a chance to talk with other folks. So what I invite you to talk about in the breakout rooms is, what are some things that you would be interested in trying out? Maybe even what you have been trying out already. What limitations or concerns do you see? And then what can you try out in the short term? I'm presenting in February. The semester is already underway. And so, it might be worth thinking about, here are some ways I can integrate self-assessment. Here's some ways I can integrate minimal grading. Here are some ways I can integrate collaborative assessment into the project. And then maybe next semester, when I have more time to plan, here are the things I want to do longer term. So this is the document that I've provided for you. I've given you an email address there. I've given you a lot of scholarly resources. The one I wanted to point you towards is Susan Blum's collection, Ungrading. For those of you here at UT, we have this in our collections, so you should be able to look it up in our library. And then if you, I think self-designed points, if you're just getting into this, are a really good entry point. So I've included that. Here's a couple of non-scholarly resources. And then I've included a site with my own ungrading resources, what it looks like for me here. I've included a SOUS blog, again, my email address, and then another website here with a collective of some educators thinking through ungrading choices on the web. So I'm going to stop the share again. It was a pleasure to have you all here. If you want to talk more about ungrading, please feel free to send me an email. I love talking with people one-on-one about how it's going for them, about questions they have, about how to make it work in their class. So I would be delighted to connect outside of the session. But regardless, I appreciate your attendance today. It was a lot of fun to get to talk about this with you, and I hope you have a really good rest of your day.